Before you sign that, I need you to look at row 47, all of you. The words landed flat and unhurried, the way a closing entry lands in a ledger that has already been checked twice. It was 4 in the afternoon on the 31st floor of a Yayuido tower, glass walls holding the whole gray width of the Han River, when Ngozi Adaeze-Chukwu opened a single spreadsheet in front of 11 executives who had already decided her fate. Her employment visa depended on the signature of the man seated at the head of that table. Everyone in the room expected the foreign accountant to apologize, collect her severance, and disappear quietly into the elevator. What happened instead cost the chairman's own son his seat at that table, and neither of them would ever take the words back. 6 months earlier, Ngozi had arrived in Seoul with a chartered accountant's certificate from Lagos, a single suitcase, and a sponsorship letter from Yosung International Trading that named her as proof the company took its overseas compliance seriously. She sent 40% of every paycheck home before she paid her own rent, her mother's clinic bills, a younger brother's tuition, a sister 2 years from graduating, arithmetic she ran in her head the way other people hummed a song. At the office, she was assigned to cross-border vendor reconciliations, the ledger's senior staff called boring, and left for the newest hire. Nobody expected her to read every line. She read every line anyway, on weekends, in an empty office, because that was the only kind of insurance a visa like hers could buy. Yosung Group ran on paperwork the way a body runs on blood. Thousands of invoices a month, vendor contracts routed through delegated signatures, approvals that moved so fast most people trusted the software instead of the source. In that current, a single account had been quietly diverting a small percentage of freight payments for years, never enough to trip an alarm, always exactly disguised as rounding. It was the kind of theft built by someone who understood, better than anyone, exactly how far no one would look. Ngozi found it not because she was clever, though she was, but because she was the only person in that building still checking the arithmetic by hand, alone. On a Saturday, no one asked her to work. What followed was not a scandal invented for headlines, though headlines would eventually try to claim it. It was a small number that refused to disappear, a report that vanished into a drawer, and a silent junior executive who had been watching her work far longer than she knew. It was a suspension meant to end quietly in her disgrace, a rented office in Mapo lit by a single lamp, a grandmother's side dish stall that took her in before any boardroom would, and a chairman who tested her with money before he tested her with truth. It was two people choosing, separately and then together, to finish what one spreadsheet had started, and a number, circled once in red pencil, that would end up on the wall of an office neither of them could have predicted this is where they'd stand. Every morning at 6, before the Seoul subway filled with commuters, Ngozi Adaeze-Chukwu opened her banking app and sent $700 to Lagos before she let herself think about breakfast. It was a ritual older than her job at Yosung International Trading. First her mother's clinic account, then her brother Emeka's tuition portal, then whatever was left folded quietly into savings she never touched. At the office by 7:30, she was always the first analyst at her desk on the 11th floor of the International Audit Wing, her blazer pressed, her spreadsheets color-coded in a system none of her colleagues had bothered to learn. She had a chartered accountant certificate from Lagos and 3 years auditing multinational shipping contracts before Yosung's recruiters found her, impressed enough to sponsor her visa, careful enough to never mention it again. Her colleagues were polite in the particular Seoul way that meant distance rather than warmth, greeting her each morning with a bow precise enough to close any further conversation. She did not mind, or told herself she didn't. She had not come to Seoul to be liked. She had come to be exact, because exactness was the only currency that traveled home in dollars, and exactness, she was about to learn, was more dangerous in that building than anyone had warned her. The assignment came from her supervisor, a tired deputy director named Mr. Beck, delivered the way unwanted chores usually were, wrapped in a compliment. "You have the patience for it," he said. sliding a stack of vendor reconciliation files across her desk. Cross-border freight and logistics payments, 3 years of them, the kind of ledger senior auditors traded away at the first opportunity because the numbers rarely told an interesting story. Nobody else on the international team wanted the account. The invoices came in 6 currencies, the vendor codes were inconsistent, and the payment approvals were buried under a delegation structure, so layered that tracing a single transaction back to a human signature took the better part of an afternoon. Ngozi did not complain. She had learned in 3 different countries now that the files nobody wanted were often the files nobody had actually checked, and that unglamorous work performed without an audience was still work, still visible to someone, even if that someone was only her own conscience. She built a tracking spreadsheet from scratch, index by index, vendor by vendor, and told herself she would finish the freight logistics files by the end of the quarter. She did not yet know how much that promise would cost her. It appeared first as a rounding oddity, the kind any auditor sees 100 times a year and dismisses. A vendor called Bowman Logistics Partners, contracted for freight coordination out of the Busan port, invoiced Yosung International Trading at rates that ran consistently 2.5% above the market benchmark she had built from competitor contracts. 2.5% every month for 11 consecutive quarters, not once higher, not once lower. Real market fluctuation did not behave that way. Real numbers wobbled, spiked with fuel costs, dipped in slow seasons. This number held its line like something engineered, disciplined as a heartbeat, dressed up each time in a slightly different justification, a surcharge here, a currency adjustment there, always just persuasive enough to survive a glance. Ngozi sat back from her monitor at 9 in the evening. The office emptied around her except for the hum of the air conditioning, and felt the particular cold clarity that came from recognizing a pattern too clean to be an accident. She did not say anything to anyone. She opened a blank spreadsheet instead, titled it only with a date, and began quietly pulling every Bowman invoice back to the contract's very first month, wondering how long something this small could hide inside something this large. She came in on a Saturday, the audit floor silent except for a single cleaning cart parked near the elevators, and spread 3 years of Bowman invoices across 2 monitors and a printed spreadsheet she annotated by hand, because some patterns only surfaced under a pencil. Every payment authorization above a certain threshold required 2 signatures. Every Bowman invoice, without exception, landed just under that threshold, split occasionally into 2 separate transactions filed 2 days apart, when a single invoice would have crossed the line. The delegated signature belonged, in every instance she could trace, to one name: Director Han Sung-wook, Senior Director of Vendor Management, a man she had met exactly twice in the hallway, both times gracious enough to remember her name. She circled the recurring figure in red pencil on a printed page, row 47 of her master file, a small, unremarkable number that would later mean far more than she could have guessed, and sat with it a long moment before allowing herself to name what she was looking at. Not an error, a structure, something built by a person who understood the approval system well enough to walk along its exact edge for years without ever once being asked a single question. She did not tell anyone that Saturday, or the Monday after, or the week after that. She had learned, in 3 countries and 2 languages of office politics, that the person who raises an alarm too early is remembered for the alarm and not for being right. Instead, she verified the pattern a second time using an independent method, recalculating market benchmarks from a different data source, cross-checking currency conversion tables, ruling out every innocent explanation she could construct, because if she was going to name a senior director's signature in a report, she needed to be more careful with the truth than anyone in that building had ever been with her. Her visa depended on Yosung's continued sponsorship. Her mother's clinic account depended on her paycheck. A misstep here would not simply cost her a promotion. It could end with a plane ticket back to Lagos and a family whose monthly arithmetic collapsed without her. So she built her case slowly, silently, the way she built everything. and told herself that when she finally spoke, she would speak with a file so complete that doubting it would take more effort than believing it. She had no way yet of knowing who, exactly, was already watching her do it. 6 weeks after that first Saturday, Ngozi finished a 22-page report and submitted it through the only channel the employee handbook actually described, an internal compliance disclosure routed to her direct supervisor before escalation to the audit committee. She wrote it the way she wrote everything, stripped of adjectives, built entirely from numbers and dates and the invoice references that let anyone check her work without trusting her word for it. She did not name a motive. She did not speculate about intent. She stated only what the ledger showed, a repeated deviation, a signature pattern, a threshold structure that could not plausibly be accidental. Mr. Bake read it at his desk with the particular stillness of a man recognizing that a quiet week had just ended, then looked up at her with something between admiration and dread. "You're sure about this?" he said. "Not really a question." "I checked it 3 times, she answered, and did not add that she had in fact checked it 5. He told her he would forward it that afternoon. She thanked him, returned to her desk, and spent the rest of the day unable to concentrate on anything else, waiting for a response that would take far longer to arrive than either of them expected. For 3 days nothing happened, which in a building that processed thousands of transactions an hour felt like its own kind of answer. Then Mr. Beck stopped her in the corridor near the vending machines, glancing twice toward the audit committee's frosted glass conference room before speaking. The report had gone up, he said, quietly, to the head of internal audit, who had in turn requested a preliminary meeting with senior compliance before any formal investigation could open. Standard procedure, he assured her, though his voice did not sound entirely convinced by his own reassurance. A meeting had been scheduled for the following Thursday. Ngozi thanked him and returned to her desk, where she allowed herself, for the first time in 6 weeks, a small private measure of relief. She had done everything by the book. The system, slow as it was, appeared to be working exactly as the handbook promised it would. She did not yet understand how thin that promise became once it reached a floor high enough that the people reviewing her numbers had dinner, on occasion, with the man those numbers implicated. Thursday's meeting would come and go without her ever being told what was said inside it. Thursday's meeting was postponed to the following week, then postponed again, each time for a reason plausible enough on its own: a scheduling conflict, a quarter-end close, an executive traveling to the Busan facility for reasons unrelated, everyone assured her, to freight vendor contracts. Ngozi kept working because the alternative was to stop, and stopping felt like admitting the report might already be dead. She requested a status update through the proper channel and received, after 4 days, a 2-line email thanking her for her diligence and noting the matter remained under internal review. Under internal review, she was beginning to understand, was a phrase that could hold a case suspended indefinitely, neither closed nor advanced, filed somewhere between a drawer and a shredder. She began keeping her own private timeline, dated and saved outside the company network, a habit she had never needed before and hoped never to need again. At her desk each evening, she reopened the Bowman file out of a stubbornness she could not fully explain even to herself, checking whether anything had changed. Nothing had. The 2.5% still repeated, disciplined and untouched, exactly as it had for 3 years running. It was a junior analyst named Sumin, the only person on the floor who had ever offered Ngozi more than a polite bow, who finally said out loud what everyone else had only implied. They were refilling water bottles near the pantry when Sumin lowered her voice to something just above a whisper. "Director Han trained half the compliance department," she said. "People don't investigate him. They apologize to him." She did not say it unkindly. If anything, her tone carried a warning meant as a kindness. The kind colleagues offered each other in buildings where speaking plainly could cost a career. Ngozi asked whether Sumin had ever seen anyone challenge him directly. Sumin's silence answered before her words did. "Once," she finally said. "He left the company within the year." Ngozi carried that sentence back to her desk like a stone in her pocket, turning it over through the rest of the afternoon. She was not naive about power. She had grown up watching how it moved in Lagos too, quietly, through favors and family, and the unspoken understanding of who got questioned and who did not. What she had not yet decided was whether knowing that would change what she did next, or only how carefully she did it. The weeks that followed settled into a strange, watchful quiet. Her emails about the case went unanswered longer each time. Meetings she should have been included in, as the report's author, happened without her, and she learned of their existence only secondhand, through the faint residue of hallway conversations that stopped when she approached. She was not removed from the audit team, not officially reprimanded, not accused of anything at all. She was simply, gradually, made invisible in the specific administrative way that large organizations perfected long before anyone needed a word for it. No one told her the investigation had stalled. No one told her it hadn't. She kept coming in early, kept sending her $700 to Lagos before breakfast, kept updating her private timeline each evening with a discipline that had nothing left to prove and nowhere left to go. What she did not know, could not have known from her desk on the 11th floor, was that on a floor 11 stories above hers, a man who rarely spoke in meetings had begun quietly requesting copies of every document with her name on it, reading each one twice, the way she read everything herself. 6 weeks of silence was long enough. Ngozi requested a formal hearing before the full audit committee, a right buried in Section 14 of the Compliance Handbook that, as far as she could tell from the surprised pause in HR's response, almost no one had ever exercised. It was not a comfortable request to make. It meant naming, in a room full of people who outranked her by decades, that a report she had filed through the correct channel had been allowed to quietly die, and that she believed it deserved better than a slow administrative burial. She rehearsed nothing beyond the numbers themselves, because the numbers, she had decided, were the only part of this she fully controlled. On the evening before the hearing was confirmed, she sat alone in the office kitchen with a cup of tea gone cold, running the arithmetic of her own situation the way she ran every other kind. If the hearing went badly, her sponsorship could be reviewed. If her sponsorship was reviewed, her family's monthly numbers stopped balancing within 2 months. She sent the confirmation email anyway. Whatever waited on the other side of that hearing room door, she had decided she would rather face it having spoken than face her mother's bills having stayed silent. From his office on the 31st floor, Yoon Jae-hyun had a clean line of sight down into the glass atrium where the audit floor's lights stayed on longest. He had noticed her months before the report ever reached his desk, not as a name, not yet, only as a lit window that stayed lit on Saturdays when the rest of the building went dark, a single figure rechecking ledgers no policy required her to recheck. He was 2 years into a probationary period his father called succession and the board called an experiment, a stretch of time during which he was permitted to sit in meetings but rarely permitted to speak in them, permitted to review contracts but expected, mostly, to sign what senior directors placed in front of him without asking too many questions about how they had arrived there. He had spent his entire adult life being handed documents he was trusted to approve and rarely trusted to challenge. Something about the woman in that lit window unsettled the arrangement without her ever knowing his name. She was not being paid to notice what she noticed. She did it anyway, alone, unrewarded, on her own time. He found, to his quiet surprise, that he had begun keeping a private file of his own. Jae-hyun's office held almost nothing personal: a desk, 2 monitors, a single framed photograph of his grandmother that he kept angled so visitors rarely noticed it. He had been raised inside Yosung Group the way other children were raised inside a language, absorbing its grammar before he understood he was learning one, which signatures mattered, which meetings mattered, which silences were expected of him at family dinners where his father discussed quarterly earnings the way other fathers discussed weather. He signed easily 100 documents a week. He had long ago stopped reading most of them line by line, trusting the system beneath his signature the way a passenger trusts a plane's instruments without understanding the physics. It was, he privately suspected, the exact trust that men like Director Han had learned to rely on. He requested, quietly and without explanation to his assistant, copies of every Bomun Logistics invoice referenced in the audit report circulating somewhere above his floor. He read them the way he had never let himself read anything at work, slowly, twice, comparing the woman's calculations against the raw invoices until his own arithmetic confirmed hers to the decimal point. He was, for the first time in years, checking someone else's work instead of merely trusting it. There was one Saturday in particular he kept returning to. He had come into the office to avoid a family dinner he did not want to attend, and from the glass corridor outside his own floor he had looked down and seen her, 11 floors below, alone at her desk, a paper cup of instant coffee going cold beside a stack of printed invoices she was checking by hand with a red pencil, the way an older generation of accountants worked before anyone trusted software completely. She had no idea she was being watched. She was not performing diligence for an audience. There was no audience, only the work itself and whatever private standard she was holding herself to. He had stood at that window for longer than he would later admit to anyone, watching a stranger do, without reward or recognition, exactly what he had never once done with his own signature. It occurred to him, standing there, that he had spent his career being trusted with power he rarely earned, while she was spending her Saturday earning trust no one had offered to give her. He did not introduce himself. He was not yet certain what he would say, or whether a man in his position had any right to say it at all. The hearing, when it finally convened, was not held in the small compliance room she had expected, but in the main executive boardroom on the 31st floor, 11 senior figures seated around a table longer than her entire apartment. She understood, within the first 3 minutes, that the room's architecture had already been decided before she walked in. The head of internal audit opened not with her findings, but with a review of her onboarding file, her probationary status, a pointed mention of cultural adjustment challenges that had nothing to do with any ledger. Director Han sat near the head of the table, composed and gracious as always, occasionally nodding as though her own report were being read back to her as evidence against her judgment rather than evidence of anyone's fraud. She recognized the shape of what was happening with a cold, almost professional clarity. This was not a review of her findings. This was the construction of a narrative in which a foreign accountant, difficult and overzealous, had manufactured a controversy out of routine currency adjustments, and the kindest available resolution was a quiet severance before the situation embarrassed anyone further. She kept her spine straight and her voice level, and waited for whatever came next, because she had learned that the room only won if she flinched first. The head of internal audit slid a single sheet across the table, a recommendation for immediate administrative suspension, pending review of her conduct and judgment, language vague enough to mean anything, and specific enough to end a career. Someone mentioned, almost casually, that visa sponsorship reviews were routine in cases of administrative suspension, as though it were simply a box to be checked, rather than a sentence handed to her entire family in Lagos. Director Han spoke only once, gently, almost kindly, suggesting that perhaps Ms. Chukwu had simply misunderstood standard currency adjustment procedures common to international freight contracts, an easy mistake for someone new to the market. It was, Ngozi thought, a masterclass in condescension dressed as generosity. She opened her mouth to answer, to say, calmly, that she had recalculated the benchmark 5 independent ways and would welcome anyone in the room to check her arithmetic in front of her right now. When the head of internal audit reached for a pen to formalize the suspension, she had rehearsed exactly this moment for weeks and still felt the floor tilt slightly beneath her chair. Before the pen touched paper, a voice she did not recognize, low and unhurried, spoke for the first time since the meeting began, and every head at the table turned toward the far end of the room. Before you sign that, Jae-hyun said, I'd like everyone to look at row 47. He had entered the room 10 minutes earlier and said nothing until this exact moment, watching the meeting build its case with the patience of a man who understood exactly how these rooms worked, because he had spent his whole life inside them. He set his own copy of the report on the table, her red pencil circle photocopied faithfully onto his own page, and stated plainly, without theatrics, that he had independently verified every figure she had flagged, that he had done so weeks ago on his own time, and that if her numbers were wrong, the failure belonged equally to his own oversight of the division that had approved them. It was. Everyone in the room understood immediately, both a defense of her and an indictment of himself, the chairman's son, on probation for the very succession this room existed to protect, choosing to attach his own name to a controversy his family would have preferred quietly buried. He requested a full external audit, formally, on the record. The head of internal audit, caught between two yuns at once, adjourned the meeting within the hour. By that evening, both of them had been placed on administrative suspension, her for raising the question, him for refusing to let it be answered quietly. News moved through Yosung Group the way it always did, faster through the elevators than through any official memo. By the next morning, everyone on the 11th floor knew that the chairman's reserved, rarely heard son had stood up in a boardroom for a foreign junior accountant, and the interpretations multiplied before lunch, some generous, most not. Ngozi cleared her desk under the quiet, watchful eyes of colleagues who suddenly found reasons to avoid her gaze entirely, the same distance dressed now in a different fabric. Su-min was the only one who met her eyes on the way out, mouthing a single word that Ngozi understood as both warning and blessing. She rode the elevator down 31 floors alone, her badge already deactivated, a box of desk items balanced against one hip, and allowed herself, for the length of that descent, to feel the full weight of what she had just done to her own life. She did not regret filing the report. She was less certain, riding down in that silence, whether she had made things better or simply made the ending arrive faster. Somewhere in the building above her, a man she had never formally met was clearing his own desk for reasons that were, and were not, entirely about her. He found her 3 days later, not at the office but outside the small immigration support center where she had gone to ask, quietly and with dwindling patience, what a suspension meant for her sponsorship status. He was waiting near the entrance in a coat too plain for a man whose name was on the building she had just been suspended from, and he did not apologize for approaching her, only explained, directly, that the external audit would take months, and that neither of their internal accounts of events would matter half as much as an independently reconstructed paper trail. "I have access to records you don't," he said. "You understand the numbers better than anyone in that building, including me." It was not, she noted, an apology, a flirtation, or a rescue. It was a proposal between two suspended professionals who needed each other's specific competence to survive an investigation neither of them controlled. She considered it for exactly as long as it took to finish her tea. They agreed on neutral ground, not his family's offices, not anywhere connected to Yosung, and settled, within the week, on a small rented room above a hardware shop in Mapo, chosen because neither of them had ever set foot there before. The office in Mapo was one room above a hardware shop, furnished with a folding table, two mismatched chairs, and a window that looked out onto a narrow street where an elderly noodle vendor set up the same cart every morning at 6. It smelled, the first week, of dust and machine oil from the shop below, until Ngozi began bringing containers of jollof rice from the only Nigerian grocer she had found in 3 years in Seoul, and the smell of tomato and smoked paprika began winning the argument against everything else in the room. Jae-hyun ate it the first time without comment, the second time with a question about the ingredients, the third time with something close to real appetite, sitting on an overturned crate because there were only 2 chairs and he had quietly decided, without saying so, that hers was the better one. He brought instant coffee at first, then eventually stopped pretending he preferred it to what she made, and began arriving with actual groceries instead. Neither of them mentioned that a man with his family's resources could have furnished the entire building in an afternoon. The plainness, they both seemed to understand without discussing it, was doing something neither of their previous lives had managed to do. Grandmother O had run her side dish stall in the market 3 streets from that hardware shop for 41 years, long enough to know every face that passed twice, and she noticed the foreign woman before her own grandson ever brought her name up at dinner. Ngozi had come in one evening looking for something resembling home, and left with a container of kimchi she hadn't asked for, and a lecture, delivered half in Korean and half in gesture, about eating properly during difficult work. Halmoni did not know, that first week, exactly what trouble the young woman and her grandson were untangling in the room above the hardware shop, only that Jae-hyun visited her more often than he had in years, and that he seemed, for the first time she could remember, tired in an honest way rather than a hollow one. She decided, with the particular authority grandmothers reserved for such decisions, that the accountant would be fed properly, whether she asked for it or not. She began setting aside Banshin for her the way she did for family, long before Jae-hyun worked up whatever courage it would eventually take to introduce Ngozi formally as anything at all. Some belonging, Halmoni had learned across 4 decades of watching the market, never waited for permission from anyone's parents. It was Halmoni's idea, offered sideways over a bowl of soup the way her ideas usually arrived. Half the merchants in the market kept their books on scraps of paper and instinct, cheated occasionally by suppliers who understood arithmetic better than they did, and she had watched Ngozi organize the little rented office above the hardware shop with a precision that made her curious what else the young woman knew. "Teach them," she said simply, nodding toward the market outside, offering no further explanation because none was needed. Ngozi hesitated only a moment before agreeing, and began spending an hour most evenings at a folding table set up between the tofu stall and the dried anchovy vendor, teaching 6 merchants old enough to be her grandparents how to track a simple ledger, how to spot when a supplier's invoice quietly inflated a price the way Baumund Logistics had inflated freight rates for 3 years running. They paid her in food and in trust, both currencies she found herself needing more than she expected. Watching from a distance one evening, Jae-hyun realized that the market had absorbed her more completely in a month than his own family's circles had absorbed anyone new in a decade, and he found himself wondering what that said about each. Most nights ended the same way, the two of them at the folding table long after the market had gone quiet, a pot of jjigae warming on a single burner Jae-hyun had bought without being asked. Printouts spread between them like a puzzle assembled one honest piece at a time. They had, by the 6th week, reconstructed nearly the full pattern. Baumann Logistics Partners registered under a holding structure that traced 3 layers down to a relative of Director Han's wife. Invoices split deliberately to stay under the 2-signature threshold, a rounding formula consistent enough to prove intent rather than coincidence. Ngozi worked the numbers. Jae-hyun worked the internal approval chains, matching signatures to meeting calendars, proving who had known what and when. They rarely discussed anything beyond the case in those hours, and yet something had settled between them that had nothing to do with romance and everything to do with the specific intimacy of 2 people trusting each other's competence completely, at 2 in the morning, over a pot going slightly too salty because neither of them was much of a cook. "Row 47, Jae-hyun said one night, tapping the page where her original red pencil circle had started everything. "It's going to hold," she hoped, more than she let herself say, that he was right. He asked about Lagos only once, carefully, on a night when the case notes were finished early and the silence in the small office had nowhere useful left to go. She told him the practical outline: a mother, a clinic bill that never quite closed, a brother in university, a sister 2 years behind him, and stopped there, deliberately, before the story reached anything that cost more to say out loud. He did not push. He asked no follow-up question, offered no comparison to his own family, simply nodded and let the subject close itself the way she had closed it, which surprised her more than any question could have. She had grown used to people either avoiding the subject of her family entirely or turning it into something to be pitied, a story about hardship rather than a story about people she loved. He did neither. When she finally asked, weeks later and on her own initiative, whether his own family dinners were as difficult as his silences suggested, he answered in exactly the same measured amount she had given him. Enough to be true, not enough to be an invitation for sympathy. It was, she thought, its own kind of respect, learned by 2 people who had both spent years protecting information as carefully as they protected numbers. She noticed, over the weeks in Mapo, the specific shape of his tiredness, not the loud exhaustion of overwork but something quieter, the fatigue of a man who had spent his adult life signing documents he had never been permitted to question, agreeing at dinners to plans he had never been asked to help design. She did not ask him directly what the succession probation actually cost him. She had learned, from her own guardedness, to recognize a boundary in someone else even when it wasn't spoken aloud, and she let him arrive at whatever he chose to say in his own time, rather than mining it out of him with questions dressed as concern. Some evenings he talked without prompting, about a father who measured affection in earnings reports, about a childhood spent learning which silences were expected of him before he understood why. Other evenings he said nothing at all, and she let that be enough too, refilling his cup of tea without comment, leaving the space unpressured. It struck her, watching him work through a column of approval dates with more patience than she'd ever seen him show anything else, that he was, in his own restrained way, teaching himself something the same way she had once had to, slowly and mostly alone. He told her, finally, on a night the printer in the corner had run out of ink and neither of them felt like fixing it, what he had actually meant when he said she understood numbers better than he did. It was not a compliment about arithmetic. It was that she read a ledger the way she read a room, for what was hidden beneath the surface presentation, for what didn't add up even when everything appeared to, and that in 30 years inside Yosung Group, no one had ever taught him to look at anything, a spreadsheet or a person, that closely. "You're the first person who's ever made me actually read something," he said, instead of just signing it. She did not answer with words. She reached across the folding table and moved his bowl half an inch closer to the good side of the burner, the side that kept food warm longest, a small, unremarkable gesture she performed for herself every night without thinking. He noticed. She saw him notice. Neither of them said anything else about it, and the quiet that followed held something neither romance novels nor audit reports had adequate language for. Two careful people, recognizing each other and choosing for one more night to stay exactly as careful as they'd always been. The message arrived through her lawyer rather than through Jae-hyun, which told her something about how the family intended to handle what came next. Chairman Yoon Tae-sung wished to meet with her, alone, without his son present, at a private dining room in a hotel far from either the Yoido Tower or the Mapo office, a location chosen, she understood immediately, for its complete absence of witnesses. She told Jae-hyun about the request that evening, watching his jaw tighten in a way she had learned meant more than any sentence he might have said aloud. "You don't have to go," he told her. "I know," she answered. "I'm going anyway." She had built her entire case on the principle that the truth survived exposure to a room. She was not about to start avoiding rooms now, not even the one belonging to the most powerful man she had ever agreed to sit across from. She spent the night before rereading her own report line by line, not because she doubted it, but because she wanted every number available to her instantly, without hesitation, in case the chairman intended to test her competence rather than her price. She suspected, correctly, that he intended to test both. Chairman Yoon received her without ceremony, seated at a low table in a private room with only 2 settings and a pot of tea neither of them touched. He was not the cartoon of corporate menace she had half expected. He asked precise questions about her methodology, listened without interrupting as she walked him through the Bamun rate deviation and the signature threshold pattern, and nodded once, slowly, in a way that suggested genuine respect rather than performance. "You are thorough," he said when she finished. "I built a company on the assumption that thoroughness eventually gets rewarded. I have learned over 40 years that this is not always true, and I am old enough now to regret how often I let it slide regardless." It was, she recognized, both an admission and a warning, that he understood exactly what Director Han had likely done, and that understanding had not yet translated into action. She did not fill the silence that followed with gratitude or relief. She had learned in that boardroom weeks earlier that silence in a room like this one was rarely accidental, and she waited, hands folded, for whatever the chairman had actually invited her here to say, certain it had not yet been said. He named the figure without embarrassment, sliding a folded document across the table the way Director Han had once slid a suspension recommendation, an amount large enough to resettle her entire family in Lagos twice over, in exchange for her resignation, a signed confidentiality agreement, and her formal withdrawal from any further involvement in the external audit. He framed it, carefully, as generosity rather than pressure, a graceful exit from a situation that had already cost her more than any junior accountant should have had to pay. He mentioned, almost in passing, that visa sponsorships could be complicated things to maintain during prolonged internal investigations, a sentence she understood immediately as both a threat and an offer dressed identically. She looked at the document for a long moment, not because she was tempted, but because she wanted him to watch her actually consider it and understand that her refusal, when it came, would not be impulsive. "I appreciate that you're being direct," she finally said, "so I'll return the courtesy." She did not raise her voice. She did not need to. What she said next would determine, more than any spreadsheet had, exactly what kind of person the chairman was dealing with. "I didn't file that report to be paid to forget it," she said. "I filed it because Bowman Logistics has been taking money that belonged to this company for 3 years, and because staying quiet has never once fixed a number that was wrong." She pushed the folded document back across the table, unopened past the first page. "I don't want your money, Chairman Yoon. I want the audit to finish, not settled quietly, not resolved with a resignation letter nobody reads, finished, on the record, whatever it costs whoever it implicates. That's my condition, not my price. Give me that, and I'll go back to my desk when it's over, and never mention this room again." The chairman studied her for a long moment, something shifting behind his composed expression that she could not fully read. Not offense, she thought, and not quite respect either, but something closer to recalculation, the specific look of a powerful man realizing he had misjudged the cost of the person sitting across from him. He did not answer immediately. He folded the document himself, returned it to his coat, and told her only that he would consider what she'd said, a sentence that gave her nothing certain, and, she suspected as she left the room, everything she actually needed. Jae-hyun learned only the outline of what happened in that hotel room, because Ngozi told him plainly and without embellishment, and because his father, true to a lifetime of habit, said nothing about it directly. But something changed in the days that followed that Jae-hyun recognized without needing an explanation. The external audit request, stalled for weeks in procurement approvals, was suddenly and quietly expedited. An outside accounting firm with no prior relationship to Yosung Group was engaged within the week, and Director Han, for the first time since the case began, was formally placed on notice pending review. His father had not softened. Jae-hyun doubted his father was capable of softening in any way visible from the outside, but he recognized, in the specific efficiency of what followed, the particular respect his father reserved for people who refused to be managed, a respect Jae-hyun himself had spent 30 years trying and mostly failing to earn through obedience instead. He said none of this to Ngozi directly. He only told her, the next evening in the MAPO office, that the external auditors had requested every document they'd assembled and watched something in her posture finally, briefly, relax for what felt like the first time in months. The article appeared on a financial gossip site before it appeared anywhere with actual editorial standards, built almost entirely from an anonymous source inside Yosung Group and a single blurry photograph of the two of them leaving the MAPO office late at night. The headline did not mention Bowman Logistics, or vendor fraud, or a 3-year pattern disciplined enough to be engineered. It mentioned an affair. It suggested, with the confident vagueness gossip journalism specialized in, that a foreign accountant had manufactured a controversy to draw close to the chairman's son, and that both suspensions were theater covering something far more personal than either of them would admit. Ngozi read it standing in her own kitchen at 6 in the morning, her phone already buzzing with messages from colleagues she hadn't heard from in weeks, each one more curious than concerned. She felt something she hadn't expected to feel, not embarrassment exactly, but a specific fury at watching months of careful, exact, unglamorous work reduced to a rumor about romance because rumor traveled faster and sold better than an audit ever could. She thought of every number she had checked twice, every Saturday spent alone with a red pencil, and wondered how quickly all of it could be erased by a headline nobody would bother fact-checking. The fallout reached Jae-hyun through channels far more direct than a gossip site, board members calling his father's office to express concern about optics ahead of the succession vote, a cousin forwarding the article with a mocking comment, his own mother asking, over a phone call he did not enjoy, whether any of it was true. He answered her honestly that the case was real, that the fraud was real, and that whatever existed between himself and Ngozi was neither the scandal the article implied nor anyone's business but their own. He worried less about his own reputation, which had absorbed worse in 30 years, than about hers, a visa-dependent employee now publicly framed as either a schemer or a victim, with no version of that story that made her ordeal any easier to carry. He called her that evening, uncertain what comfort he could actually offer a woman who had built her entire life around being taken seriously and had just watched a headline undo that in a single sentence. She did not need comforting, it turned out, not the way he expected. She needed, she told him plainly, exactly what she had needed since the beginning, for the audit to finish, and for neither of them to dignify the noise with a public denial that would only feed it further. They agreed, over the last of the jjigae that night, not to issue a statement, not to grant an interview, not to perform outrage for an audience that would forget the story within a news cycle regardless of what they said. If we deny it, it becomes a bigger story, Ngozi said. If we explain it, it becomes a longer story. The only thing that actually answers it is the audit report, finished, with our names nowhere near the headline. Jaehyun agreed, though she could see it cost him something to stay silent while strangers speculated about his family and his character in comment sections he had promised himself, and mostly failed, not to read. They returned instead to the printouts spread across the folding table, the same discipline that had gotten them this far, because the story neither of them could control was the one written by people who had never checked a single invoice, and the only story they could still shape was the one built on evidence. Halmoni, hearing about the article from a neighbor before either of them mentioned it, said only that gossip was cheap and arithmetic was not, and set an extra portion of banchan aside for both of them that evening without further comment. The external audit's findings were presented 11 weeks later, in the same boardroom where Ngozi had once been minutes from a signed suspension, though this time the room felt different, smaller somehow, its architecture of intimidation less convincing now that the outcome no longer depended on who controlled the silence. The lead auditor from the independent firm, a methodical woman who introduced every finding with a document reference before she stated a conclusion, walked the room through 3 years of Bomun Logistics invoices with the same patience Ngozi herself had once applied alone at a folding table above a hardware shop. Every deviation Ngozi had flagged in her original report matched the external findings within rounding error. Every signature threshold pattern Jaehyun had traced through internal approval calendars confirmed the same conclusion from a different angle. Chairman Yoon sat at the head of the table, listening without expression, occasionally glancing toward the far end where Director Han sat with his composure still, for now, fully intact. Ngozi sat beside Jaehyun this time, not summoned to defend herself but invited to answer questions the auditors directed specifically at her methodology, a difference in seating that told its own quiet story about how far the room's assumptions had traveled since the last time she'd occupied it. Director Han remained composed through most of the presentation, offering the same measured, faintly gracious tone he had used in every meeting Ngozi had ever attended with him, until the auditor reached the ownership structure behind Bomun Logistics Partners, a holding entity traced, through 3 deliberately obscured layers, to a relative of his wife's family. He objected then, calmly at first, suggesting the connection was circumstantial, common enough in an economy as interconnected as Korea's. The auditor did not argue with him. She simply displayed the next slide, a signed approval, his signature, on an invoice split deliberately into 2 transactions, 11 minutes apart, to remain under the 2-signature threshold, dated the same week Ngozi's original report had been filed, and quietly stalled. Something in his posture finally, almost imperceptibly changed. Not an outburst, nothing so dramatic as that would have been beneath a man who had built his career on control, but a slight stillness, the particular quiet of someone recalculating how much longer a story could hold. He asked, evenly, for a short recess. Chairman Yoon granted it without expression. Ngozi watched Director Han leave the room with the same composed walk he always used, and understood, with a kind of tired satisfaction, that composure and innocence had never once been the same thing. When the meeting resumed, Jaehyun asked to speak before the board moved to any resolution, a request that visibly unsettled several members who had assumed the worst of the scandal was already behind them. He stated, plainly and for the record, that the discovery belonged entirely to Ngozi Adaeze-Chukwu, that his own contribution had been limited to verifying and defending work she had already completed alone, on her own time, with no expectation of credit or protection. He did not soften this for his father's comfort, or for the board's preference for a tidier narrative in which the family's own son had been the hero of the story. He said, further, that any resolution the board reached should reflect that the company's compliance systems had failed for 3 years, not because the truth was hard to find, but because almost no one with power had bothered looking, and that fixing the systems mattered more than protecting anyone's discomfort about the finding. Several board members exchanged uneasy glances. His father's expression did not change at all, though something in the set of his shoulders suggested he was recalculating his son's usefulness to the succession in terms that had nothing to do with obedience. Jae-hyun had spent his entire life signing what was placed in front of him. He was done doing that quietly. A senior board member, cautious about the company's public image after weeks of tabloid coverage, suggested quietly that a negotiated resignation for Director Han, handled without further disclosure, might resolve matters faster and with less damage to Yo-sung's reputation. Ngozi spoke before anyone else could agree. With respect, she said, the reputation this company should be protecting is the one that comes from actually enforcing its own rules, not the one that comes from managing headlines. She reminded the room calmly that 3 years of diverted freight payments had a specific dollar figure attached, that the vendor relationships built on that fraud likely extended beyond Bomun Logistics if anyone cared to look, and that a quiet resignation would teach every other director in the building exactly the wrong lesson about what happened when they were caught. She was not asking for cruelty, she was asking for the same thoroughness she had applied to every invoice she'd ever checked, extended now to the people, not just the numbers. Chairman Yoon, listening from the head of the table, said nothing for a long moment, then instructed the auditors to proceed with a full, on-record accounting, regardless of who it further implicated. It was, everyone in the room understood, exactly the finish Ngozi had asked for from the beginning. Director Han's resignation letter, when it finally arrived 3 weeks later, was 2 paragraphs long, procedurally correct, and entirely without drama, no public confession, no dramatic confrontation, only a formal acknowledgement of irregularities identified in vendor management, and a departure effective immediately, referred quietly to the appropriate regulatory authorities for further review. It was, Ngozi thought, reading the internal memo at her restored desk on the 11th floor, exactly the kind of ending real accountability usually produced. Not a scene from television, just paperwork finally catching up to arithmetic that had been true for years. Bomun Logistics Partners lost its vendor contract within the same week. The external audit's full findings were entered into Yo-sung Group's compliance record, available now to any future auditor who wanted to check the company's own history rather than trust its reputation blindly, the way she once had not been trusted at all. She felt no triumph exactly, sitting there, only the quiet, specific satisfaction of a number that had finally been allowed to mean what it always meant. Her visa sponsorship, reinstated formally the same week, no longer depended on a single executive's goodwill. What remained was the question of what came next, for the case, for the market, and for 2 people who had spent months learning each other slowly, over jjigae and printouts. Chairman Yoon summoned her again, this time to his actual office rather than a private dining room, and offered her the newly created position of Head of Vendor Compliance for Yo-sung International Trading, a title with real authority and a salary that would have silenced most objections on its own. Ngozi thanked him, then did what she had done in every room she had ever walked into at that company. She read the offer carefully before she signed anything. She told him she would accept, on 3 conditions. First, she wanted her own team, hired independently rather than inherited from the department that had once buried her report. Second, she wanted a contract structured so her visa sponsorship was tied to her role and to the company itself, not to any single executive's continued goodwill, so no future accountant would sit where she once sat, calculating her own vulnerability alongside her employer's numbers. Third, she wanted the internal whistleblower channel rebuilt entirely, with mandatory external review triggered automatically after any set period of internal silence, so a report like hers could never again simply vanish into someone's drawer. Chairman Yoon studied her for a long moment, something that might almost have been the beginning of a smile crossing his otherwise composed face. You negotiate like someone who already knows she's right, he said. I do, she answered. Jae-hyun's own position within the succession shifted in ways neither swift nor guaranteed. His father made no dramatic announcement, offered no sentimental concession, only began, gradually, including him in decisions he had previously only been permitted to sign. It was not vindication exactly. It was the slow, unglamorous rebuilding of trust the same way Ngozi had rebuilt her own case, one verified fact at a time. He kept the Mapo office after the case closed, quietly paying the rent himself, telling no one at Yusung it still existed. He and Ngozi continued meeting there some evenings, no longer over invoices but over nothing more complicated than dinner, a habit neither of them had formally named, and both were careful not to rush into naming. Halmoni, predictably, named it for them anyway, informing the market's tofu vendor within a week that her grandson had finally found someone with sense enough to match him, a declaration delivered with such total confidence that neither Jae-hyun nor Ngozi bothered correcting her. They kept their boundaries the way they always had, deliberate, unhurried, chosen rather than assumed, two people who had learned, across months of careful work, that trust built slowly on evidence outlasted anything built quickly on attraction alone. Whatever they were becoming it on their own terms, at their own pace. Her new office was smaller than Director Han's had been, by her own request, but it had one wall she had decorated with exactly a single item, a small mounted page from the original spreadsheet, row 47 circled once in red pencil, the number that had started everything on an ordinary Saturday when no one had asked her to work and she had come in anyway. Visitors occasionally asked about it, expecting some elaborate explanation, and she usually gave them the shortest true version, that it was the first number that refused to lie to her, and that keeping it in view reminded her, and now her own team, that the smallest deviation deserved the same attention as the largest one. Jae-hyun stopped by some evenings after his own meetings ended, no longer sneaking glances down from a glass office 11 floors above but walking in through her actual door. And the two of them would sometimes work in comfortable silence exactly the way they once had above a hardware shop in Mapo. Printouts replaced now by tablets, Jjigae replaced by whatever Halmoni had insisted on sending that week. The market still fed them both, the numbers still had to add up, and on the wall behind her desk, row 47 stayed exactly where she'd put it, proof, permanent and unglamorous, that checking the arithmetic by hand had always been worth doing.